Good morning, everyone, both here in the room and hello to all of you who are joining us from around the world. I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to Adaptation Without Borders, strengthening cooperation to manage cross-border climate risks, an event here at the EU Pavillion at COP27, convened by the European Union and the Adaptation Without Borders Global Partnership, which is led by IDRI, ODI, and SEI in cooperation with 9 other partners from around the world. My name is Katie Harris. I'm Director of Adaptation Without Borders, and it's my honor to be your chair for today's event. We are here to talk about the cross-border and cascading impacts of climate change. In our interconnected world, the impacts of climate change do not stay confined within national borders. When climate change damages critical infrastructure, such as international ports, or disrupts international markets and the trade of goods, commodities, and global services. It's taking a little while to catch up with me. When it alters international financial flows, including remittances and investments. When it impacts on the movement of people, such as tourists, pastoralists, and migrants. Or when shared natural resources and ecosystems are depleted. The effects ripple out across the world. The fantastic panel that we have here today will share examples of how a climate-related hazard in one place can trigger a cascade of consequences that cross national borders to affect people's lives and livelihoods in another. Sometimes these might affect neighboring countries, such as those who share a river. But just as we've seen with other complex risks, like COVID-19, they can also connect communities many thousands of miles apart. Also here today, we'll discuss the implications of these risks for our adaptation, programming, and planning. And I'll kick us off with 3 points for you to reflect on. We know that for too long, adaptation has been too slow and too small in scale. While mitigation has been considered a global concern, adaptation has been thought of as a local challenge. But we cannot assume that local actors are equipped to successfully adapt to these kinds of cascading impacts at an international scale. Climate risk is a shared reality, and adaptation must now become a shared responsibility. So we need new actors with new mandates and roles and responsibilities on adaptation. Furthermore, just as climate risks can cascade, so too can adaptation actions. Adaptation can create its own transboundary effects, strengthening the resilience of some at the expense of others, and redistributing vulnerability rather than reducing it. Because we develop adaptation plans at the local or national scale, and we develop them relatively independently from each other, the risk of transboundary effects is greatly increased. So we need to recognize that adaptation can create winners and losers, and ensure we are building not just resilience, but just resilience. And finally, we need to think about adaptation to multiple risks at the same time. There are many interlinked global crises facing us today, including war and contested geopolitics, debt and financial insecurity, and a food and energy crisis, in addition to the climate and biodiversity crises. These crises interact in complex ways. We cannot tackle them in silos. So we need to build resilience from a systemic perspective. And this means much greater international cooperation on adaptation. So what does this look like from a national, regional, and global level? So we will start today's event by hearing 3 perspectives from the national level. How cross-border and cascading climate risks are impacting different countries around the world, how these countries are responding to them through their adaptation processes, and the needs and opportunities for better managing them in the future. That's with Peter Bentley, Adaptation and Resilience Team Lead at the FCDO in the UK. We have Thomas Lelakotin, Deputy Director of Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry of Kenya, who is very kindly providing some remarks on behalf of Dr. Chris Kipto, Principal Secretary, who has been taken unwell. And we very much wish Dr. Kipto well in the coming days. And then Anne Hamill, Director of the NAP Global Network. We'll then move on to the regional level to hear how cross-border and cascading climate risks are impacting Africa and Europe, and the role regional organisations can play in strengthening cooperation to manage them. So we'll hear from Estherine Fotobong, Head of the Programme Implementation and Coordination Directorate at the African Union Development Agency, and Tim Benton, Research Director on Emerging Risks at Chatham House. We'll then have a 15-minute discussion with all of you, where we reflect on the opportunities at a global level for enhanced cooperation on adaptation here at COP27 and beyond. If our connections expose each other to the cross-border nature of climate risk, they also present us with an opportunity to work together and spur the kinds of international cooperation on adaptation that befit our interdependent world. But how we can harness that opportunity is what we are here to discuss today. There will be an opportunity to hear from all of you, so if you're in the room, please raise your hand during the Q&A. And if you're joining us online, please post your questions, your comments, your ideas in the live chat, which we'll be monitoring. So first of all, I'm delighted to turn to Peter. As Adaptation and Resilience Team Lead at the FCDO in the UK, can you tell us about the UK's approach to considering international and cascading climate risks in your adaptation planning processes?
Great, thank you ever so much for having us. Delighted to be here, Katie. So we know climate change is an increasing driver of so many issues, so energy, food security, migration. And although obviously this is significantly more impacting developing countries, this is also having a huge impact on the United Kingdom. You know, we are feeling this more and more, like the world is so interconnected. We're seeing this, Russia's invasion of Ukraine affecting food scarcity, but coupled with climate change challenges across the world. You know, we are seeing this kind of, our own citizens kind of in the UK are feeling this every day. And as a result, we are taking this ever more seriously. I think we're now looking at our 3rd National Adaptation Plan. So the UK was one of the first nations to enshrine climate adaptation in law, so since 2008. And we have, every 5 years, we do a full climate change risk assessment, which is put forward by, or informed by our Climate Change Committee, which is an external body. And I think it's really telling, as a big part of the National Adaptation Programme is to learn from previous years. And so neither our first nor our second National Adaptation Plan took international risks into account. Like, it just wasn't something on our radar. And so although it's led by our domestic department, our DEFRA, for rural affairs and farming, it has now become a whole government approach. So it's now involving our Ministry of Defence, our Foreign Office, our Department for International Trade. And we're being clear, there are opportunities here, but actually there's a huge risks to kind of the UK as we talked about, kind of food security. It's affecting migration, and this is something we're now kind of building in, and trying to take account of how do we respond, not just now, but in the long term. So we're building in scenario planning not for just 1.5, but unfortunately we're now kind of looking at the kind of 2-degree world. You know, what potentially is the UK going to look like in 5 years? But coming back to the kind of the interconnectedness, so we're both from a developmental angle, but also from a domestic angle, we see it as absolutely critical to support other countries with their adaptation, which is why we work so closely with Anne at the National Adaptation NAP-GN. We're tripling our adaptation finance to 1.5 billion in 2025, and we very much see this as something that is kind of working together, both that benefits us all. Like this needs to be a whole world approach to adaptation. Like we are all in this together. You know, there is finite water resource, there is finite food security that we can have. And you know, the UK, although it is an island, literally speaking, metaphorically speaking, you know, we can't continue to see ourselves in this way. You know, there's so much interconnected impacts. And we look forward as the UK to working with others, to helping others with their adaptation, both from their own domestic point of view, but also recognising that we both need to work together backwards and forwards. And anyway, delighted to be here, and it's so critical to us how we address this going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for outlining why the UK feels it important to be managing these sorts of cascading and cross-border climate risks in your national adaptation planning processes. Just a quick question, if I may. Do you see any opportunities here at COP27, perhaps under the UNFCCC, for countries to be working more closely together and cooperating in their adaptation planning processes? Do you think we need more international cooperation on adaptation?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, we talk about adaptation being a local issue, and of course, and from the kind of title of this event, not adapting could potentially not just have local issues but international issues. But also there's a real risk about maladaptation, where you take kind of one approach in one country that has a knock-on effect in another, and potentially, you know, unexpected, unmeant consequences that kind of move people. And I think this kind of, when we look at our risk assessments particularly, you know, we're working with the World Bank, we're looking in the national adaptation planning, is how do we kind of work with not just neighbouring countries, but also kind of trade routes. You know, you talked about rivers and things in terms of transportation, and actually kind of extrapolating beyond just what are we doing today and tomorrow, and actually saying, you know, what impact is that going to have on different countries.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter, and hopefully we can come to you again during the Q&A. Thomas, if I may turn to you now, I wonder whether you could outline for us how you see some of these cascading climate risks impacting Kenya, and what are some of the implications for adaptation planning in Kenya around capacity building and support that you need to manage these sorts of risks?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here, and apologies from my PS who was supposed to be here, but unfortunately he was not able to come. And you can allow me to go through the remarks that was intended to provide in this event. And first is that Kenya is a very vulnerable country to climate change impacts. And we have felt the impacts even now as we are here. There's a terrible drought, the worst in 40 years, that's affecting the Horn of Africa, including Kenya. So all these are evident that climate change is here, and we're all feeling the impacts. And that research from Stockholm Environment Institute suggests that Kenya ranks among the 30 countries most exposed to cross-border impacts of climate change. This is not surprising given Kenya's high economic integration with other countries worldwide and regional solid relationships with other African member states, which also face severe climate challenges. One real practical example is that, of course, as a country, we don't meet all our food demands, and we are required to import food from elsewhere. And if these other countries are impacted by climate change, reduce the level of production, then it indirectly affects us because we'll not have food or import food from these countries. And one key example has been what happened in Pakistan. We import a lot of rice from Pakistan. When Pakistan was affected by the floods, a third of the country was submerged. And part of that area that was submerged was the cropland. So when Pakistan has less rice production, and that's where we get food, rice from, then it means it escalates our food insecurity in the country. So you see the impacts of flooding that climate induced in Pakistan directly impacting Kenya and other countries that depend on Pakistan to get their food. And also the impacts of climate change affecting countries on other continents can compound and cascade risks to food security in Kenya and indeed in the countries across the world. The evidence suggests that in not only food security that cross-border climate risks can undermine, but also countries' trading relationships, export and imports, foreign direct investment, flows of remittances, movement of people into and out of the country. So it's not only about getting the food, but the trade and the investments, and how all this affects the GDPs in different countries. So it's broader to only what you can access directly from that country. We are all connected as a world, and what happens in one area affects the other countries. Although another example is our borders are quite porous, and livestock is a key livelihood source to most of the communities living along the borders. So wherever you have a drought in one part of the Horn of Africa, the livestock will cross borders to other countries, and they come with the diseases. Also, it escalates conflict over resources because you have limited resources in terms of pastures and waters, and we start having intercommunal conflicts that really affect other production processes within the country. Actually, to understand the risks that are generated from climate impacts transmitted across spatial scales, we have to account for the social and economic context of where they originate and eventually occur. So you have to have a broader look, not only the localized impact, but does it originate from somewhere else? And is there a need to reach out to also address the origin so that you have a sustainable solution? And also to look at the future of cross-border risks. We have been collaborating very closely with the Stockholm Environmental Institute, and we had a very consultative workshop just to discuss this issue in detail. And from the workshop, we started to develop some key pointers in how to address the cross-border risks. One of them is increasing, what's coming out is this, we have increasing competition with the neighboring countries over water and other natural resources. We're also having climate-induced economic migration, and how does that affect the issues of insecurity among those communities, and also reduce or unsustainable tourism, because as we have these migrants, we have had issues of increased poaching, and how does that affect wildlife and tourism indirectly. Also reduce official development assistance, and of course various impacts to cross-border trade and investment as a result of climate impacts in East Africa region. A high number of all these was focused on regional and international adaptation activities, suggesting that stakeholders believe that to be effective, adaptation to cross-border climate impacts must be a collaborative process and enhanced by transnational governance. So there's need to, of course, look at it at the broader regional level. In Kenya, we are members of IGAD and also members of East Africa Community. So is there a need to start coming up with policies on how to address this as a region? And also there's the need to incorporate the already existing governance processes in the region. Just a minute. And actually to sum it up is one, Kenya is vulnerable not only to climate impacts within its borders, but to global climate impacts and their cascading effects. Understanding how these impacts generate risk to Kenya's socio, economic, and environmental prospects is an urgent priority. To effectively manage this risk, adaptation must be a collaborative process enhanced by regional and global collaboration. And the Kenya government therefore calls for greater international action and cooperation on adaptation to enable African member states to identify, manage, and adapt to cross-border and cascading climate risks they face. In this context, progress on the global goal on adaptation is critical at COP27, including guidance and roadmap to delivering the global goal on adaptation by 2028. And all this, as we look at the global goal, how do we achieve the global goal under the Paris Agreement? How does this feed into global stocktake so that we can track the progress in terms of are we achieving what we set out under the Paris Agreement? So as a way forward, as countries, should we start incorporating cross-border risks in our national adaptation plans? As a country, I've identified that as a gap. As we review our NAP, I think it's very important that we give that broader outlook. Because definitely we cannot think about the country alone without these cross-border risks that are affecting everyone. And of course, how do we, as a East Africa community, as IGAD, start thinking about how to integrate cross-border risks in our policy development tools? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and for delivering those remarks on behalf of Principal Secretary Kipto. We're very grateful for you joining us today and really for outlining so compellingly how these sorts of cascading climate risks are impacting Kenya, but also some of the emerging findings on adaptation solutions and options to manage those. Anne, I'm delighted to turn to you now as Director of the NAP Global Network. I wonder, we've heard some experiences from the UK, from Kenya, whether and how you are seeing in your work under the network, whether other countries are raising these sorts of cross-border and cascading climate risks in their national adaptation plans, and what might be some of the needs and the opportunities that countries have to better manage them in future.
Great, thanks so much. And again, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. So I guess there's a few points I'd get across. The first one is that transboundary issues, cascading impacts, they are appearing in national adaptation plans and strategies, but not nearly to the extent that we would want and hope. But then at the same time, I would say that if you read them closely, they're in there. There are a lot of openings, actually, to unpack these issues and look for ways to sort of address them in a more sort of comprehensive and collaborative manner. So there are openings, but not. If you look at the 38 NAPs that are available on the UNFCCC's NAP Central, it's kind of a patchy record, if you will. That said, I would say that we're seeing more openings and more explicit mentions of transboundary issues in more recently submitted NAPs, right? So the first one was submitted in 2016, and then about half of the NAPs that are on NAP Central now have been submitted in the last 2 years. So there's been an upsurge of activity, of submissions, and I think you are seeing more reference to transboundary issues. And frankly, and this isn't me just trying to flatter you, but I do wonder if some of the messaging coming out of Adaptation Without Borders is being, really picked up and resonating with a lot of countries as they think about their national adaptation plans and strategies. Of the transboundary issues that are being mentioned in national adaptation plans, unsurprisingly, the majority of them, I would say, are related to natural resources, the natural resource base, shared water basins, shared ecosystems, even shared protected areas to some extent. For example, I believe it was South Sudan's NAP has a section in its national adaptation plan that specifically calls out transnational, transboundary issues. And it mentions things like, transboundary wildlife management, for example, for migrating species, transboundary protected area management, and how do you integrate adaptation into those strategies for all partner countries. Talks about the Nile Basin as well, and the need to, for better sort of information sharing and collaboration to understand the risks and vulnerabilities that affect the different countries in the basin. There are platforms already that have been established. So how do we just get adaptation better integrated into those platforms? And it also mentions migration, unsurprisingly, in South Sudan, and then the need for doing things like scenario exercises to be able to anticipate what climate change might mean for migration patterns or refugee patterns. So that's an example of where it's really being explicitly called out, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of that with the NAPs that are coming online in the next couple of years, even few months. I think the main thing I would want to get across, though, is I think that there are huge opportunities, and I really hope that we don't get into a place where we think, national adaptation plans, because they're national by definition, they don't really have a role to play in this conversation, and I'd say that that's not true. I think that they have a huge role to play, and a very complementary role to play in this conversation. So the first one is I mentioned that there are openings. There are already references to some of the specific issues. Like, for example, 25 of the 38 NAPs on NAP Central talk about conflict. And they talk about how conflict can be a driver of vulnerability, and how conflict might also, vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, how conflict might also result from the impacts of climate change. And so there's already an identification of adaptation being a conflict prevention and peace-building strategy that implicates neighboring countries. And so, 25 out of 38 is, and again, I think we're going to see more of this, points to opportunities to really pick up on that thread, right? And to really look at what these strategies might look like. So looking for these references and these openings. And then, a lot of the national adaptation plans point to already existing regional governance structures, coordination mechanisms, and again, building on those to sort of unpack them a bit more and make sure that they are more sort of thoughtfully pulled out in thinking about a more transboundary approach to adaptation. The main thing I would like to also sort of end with is I think that there's a really untapped opportunity, and I've been really happy to see the WTO be more present at this COP. Mm-hmm. And I do feel like trade is a huge opportunity for adaptation, and I think we're already seeing some movements on how trade agreements can be leveraged to help adaptation, both sort of at a national and a regional level, and I think that's an opportunity. And then finally, I would also say that for countries that have national adaptation plans, you can bring them to the table and having these more regional transboundary conversations, right? Because these lay out the priorities at the national level. And so I think that they can be instruments for more collaboration. And maybe I'll pause there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne. And indeed, your mention of the WTO, they had their flagship report launched yesterday on trade and climate change. We saw a big focus in that on adaptation and the role that trade policymakers and indeed the WTO can play in building resilience to these sorts of climate risks that are transmitted through the trade and supply of goods and services around the world. And you also mentioned sort of bringing groups and countries together at a regional level, and that takes us really nicely on to the next section in our event, where we'll hear two perspectives on a regional level. So I'm really delighted to welcome Estherine Fotobong, head of the Programme Implementation and Coordination Directorate at the African Union Development Agency, to the floor. And Estherine, 3 questions, if I may, for you to cover in 5 minutes. What do we know about cascading climate risks and the challenges they pose to Africa's adaptation efforts? How is the African Union responding to these? And finally, how is the African Union Development Agency taking action? And I'm delighted to give the floor to you now.
Thank you, Katie. I was trying to jot down the questions.
I can come back to them.
Yes, good. I suppose it's good morning now to everyone. And thank you for this opportunity. And we're really glad to be part of this very important conversation with you. And I hope this is just the beginning of several, not only conversation, but actions on this topic of cascading risk. The African Union, or Africa, is really one of the lowest contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions, as we all know and we have heard of so many times, as stated by the IPCC. However, climate change, again, as we know, is causing significant issues in the key developmental sectors of the continent, including in the areas of widespread loss on biodiversity. I think the previous speaker just mentioned that. Water shortages, reduction in food production, loss of life as a result of floods and droughts. And of course, all of these have a general impact on the economic growth of the continent. So this is clearly stated in the IPC reports. This impact of climate change within the African continent cascades across national borders. And the colleague from Kenya already elaborated on some of the examples within Kenya itself, but also demonstrating those cascading the risk. And unless we better identify how the impacts of climate change in one place can create risk to the lives of people and livelihoods of people in another place, we will definitely underestimate the exposure and vulnerability of African countries and the region as a whole to climate change. So I think really a better assessment of vulnerability, we are hearing about these huge resources that are needed for adaptation, looking at it from the lens of national adaptation. So I think if we actually look at the cascading risk, then the figures even probably will triple. So in terms of better accounting, we need to figure in this cascading issue. So that's just the background in terms of the challenges that we know because we are living them. In Sudan, we saw the impacts of the drought. My colleagues spoke about Kenya. And in Madagascar, the drought situation there is causing significant change in people's lives. So in terms of the African Union, what are we doing? The African Union has just adopted a climate change and resilient development strategy and action plan that will run from 2022 to 2032. So we've given ourselves a bit more time after the SDGs to be able to see the actions that we are putting in place, how they are working. And this strategy really marks a new era in the recognition of transboundary and cascading climate risk. The plan aims specifically to enhance coordination between the regional economic communities and member states in addressing and managing transboundary cascading climate risk. My colleague from Kenya did mention the role of the East African Economic Community in looking at these questions. And he gave some examples, but just really to emphasize the point, if you take the case of the livestock sector, this include trade in live animals and animal products. And this contributes to about 5 to 30% of the national GDP of African dryland countries. Widespread livestock deaths can occur during multi-country droughts, as this is currently happening across the Horn of Africa. And therefore, a country-focused approach might not give you the kind of long-term solutions that you're looking for. So it is necessary to really have regional collaboration in looking for solutions to this. And I'm really glad that my fellow panelists here spoke about protected areas and how we mainstream, adaptation risk in protected area management or wildlife management. In my previous years, I had worked in WWF, and there was good conversation those times in terms of how you manage transboundary issues, because if you take wildlife, they don't have passports that you're stopping them in the borders to say, show me the country you're coming from. So you necessarily have to take a regional approach in the management of wildlife. So that's just another example in addition to the ones that we have just heard. So from an African perspective, coordination between the African regional bodies and member states is crucial if we are really to manage the impacts of climate change that cascades across national borders within the continent. So that is within the continent, but again, another example is that Africa is also exposed to cascading climate risks originating from outside the continent.
Yeah.
And the example that one can state, and I think Kenya also spoke a bit about that, is the effect of sea level rise in low-lying countries or delta countries in Southeast Asia, countries that produce rice or that have the rice fields. And we do know that several African countries do import rice from this country. So for instance, Senegal. And the colleague spoke about maladaptation. So what happens in response that the Southeast Asian countries do take to address these issues of sea level rise have an impact on the importation of rice in Senegal. So again, it's just not only within the continent, but across the continents as well. And so the question that you asked my colleague from UK on the importance of this international cooperation, I think cannot be overemphasized in this situation. I will then just go to say, in terms of the African Union Development Agency and working with the AU at large and the regional economic communities, we've worked with AMCEN, the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, to ensure that this issue of cascading risk is taken up by AMCEN. And it's really pleasing to see that the 18th session of AMCEN that just held in Senegal actually have this as part of the issues in the outcome of the Senegal meeting. We also really look forward to working with the Adaptation Without Border partnerships because some of the work that you've done and the existing evidence that is coming out from there really demonstrate that if we don't address this issue, it will impede progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in the areas of increasing food and water insecurity, threatening trade and energy, the issue of trade again, risking the jobs and livelihoods of many Africans, worsening the inequalities that we have all seen and that was exacerbated by COVID-19. Now, if we don't do something on addressing this cascading risk, then we will not even begin to solve the problems that we have seen as shown in the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. And just overall endangering the well-being of African citizens. So we really do look forward to working with you and all the other partners who are here to do a number of things, particularly share lessons. We would like to learn from the UK experience on your reviews of your adaptation plans and how you're mainstreaming things. Look at the laws, because I don't think many African countries to date have not mainstream or have laws that look at adaptation measures in defining and implementing policies. Designing tools to help to do this. And I really like the point on scenario planning, because we really cannot take a short-term approach to this. It has to be a long-term approach, working with the countries, but ensuring that there's that collaboration across the regions of the continent so that we can better adapt to this cascading risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estherine, for talking so eloquently about the challenges continent-wide, but also some of the solutions that we see are already emerging, and how the African Union Development Agency is supporting member states and the regional economic communities to further cooperate and adapt in response to these risks in the future. Thank you. Tim, last but not least, we've heard quite a few perspectives here from a national level. We've heard a perspective just now from Estherine at a Pan-African level. I know you're doing a lot of work focused on Europe and the cascading climate risks that are impacting the European Union. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts continent-wide for Europe.
Thank you, Katie. Let's just give you a bit of context from a European perspective. So in 2010, there was a significant heat wave that hit Ukraine and Western Russia. That caused a shortfall in grain production, which is about the same size as we've seen this year. Russia put in place an export ban, food prices went up, markets panicked, other countries put in place an export ban, food prices went up. We had the rise of food insecurity across Europe quite markedly, and we also had a rise of food insecurity in the developing world, food riots in about 40 countries. It sparked the Arab Spring. It wasn't the cause of the Arab Spring, but it sparked it. That led to the geopolitical reconfiguration of the Middle East, increased flow of migrants across the Mediterranean into Europe, rise of nationalism and populism in Europe, and was one of the, 10 years later, contributory causes of the dissatisfaction in the UK with the European Union. So there's a chain of causation from one climate impact that destabilized Europe. And it's not just that. If you look at 2022, everybody thinks it's about the war, but it's not. It's about the war on the back of COVID, itself made more likely by climate change, coupled with extreme weather in 2022. All of those three things interacting, creating food price spike, energy spike, and so on. So when we think about cascading risks, or when we think about risks in general, there's the standard risk equation, which risk is a function of hazard, the events that happen, exposure, are you going to be exposed to those events, and your vulnerability to those events. And if you're thinking from the perspective of a home country, whether or not you're hit by a direct climate hazard, you can manage your infrastructure, you can manage investment, you can reduce your vulnerability quite markedly by reducing inequality or building flood defenses or things like that. When you're thinking about hazards that are impacting overseas, your exposure is not whether or not you're going to get flooded or heat wave or wildfire. Your exposure is the degree of global embeddedness, the sensitivity to people movement, financial flows, all of those sorts of things. But my home area is food security, and I can literally think of 1,000 ways that a food price spike can arise from the interaction of climate, markets, politics, and so on. 1,000 ways. If you think of a black swan event as a 1 in 1,000 probability, but there are 1,000 potential black swan events, what that means is that in any given time period, 1,000 times 1 over 1,000 equals probability 1, I cannot predict what will lead to a food price spike, but I can predict there will be a food price spike in the near-term future, or an energy price spike, or something else leading to that. So that puts a focus on building resilience, building diversity of trade routes, building diversity of logistical infrastructure. It's about redundancy. Do you have stores? Can you manage supplies instead of building just-in-time supplies, and so on and so on? Can you decentralize so you don't have single points of failure? Can you build in agility, substitutability? Can you predict what's going to happen and have the means of mitigating all of that? So that's the basic framework. So what should the EU be doing about this? Well, our exposure to risks in the EU is a function of our global embeddedness. The prime thing that we can be doing is reducing the exposure and vulnerability both within the EU, but also in the countries that we partner with. So that's about direct investment, that's about reducing inequality, that's about building trade deals that are fair and just, that pay as much to the other country as they give us in financial benefits. In concrete terms, what we haven't done very well, partly as an academic community, is built the tools, and it's lovely to see Adaptation Without Borders and programs like the Cascades program to try and get some research capacity behind understanding how risks flow through the complex geopolitical, social, economic structure. We need more research. We need stronger national adaptation planning, or across the EU adaptation planning, that integrates all of these interacting risks, not just focusing on direct hazards, not just focusing on food, but thinking about how everything interacts. We need to work very hard to reduce exposure and vulnerability at home and abroad. And of course, we need to reduce the actual hazard in the first place by mitigating directly. So all of these things come together. It does produce systemic risks for us all, these sorts of cascading risks. But it's not just about what you do at home. As many of my colleagues have said, it's also about how we, within Europe, although unfortunately UK is not within Europe, within the European Union anymore, how do we, as the rich world, take our responsibilities seriously and not just have a kind of parasitic relationship with the poor world and extracting goods, but how can we build adaptation in our self-interest as well as from a moral perspective?
Thank you, Tim, for those fantastic remarks. And I'd like to just reflect that we've heard a lot about the need in this session, the need to better understand these sorts of risks, the need for more policy solutions to these sorts of risks, and the need for more cooperation. But there are also some really encouraging developments of late. So the fact that we are seeing these risks highlighted in big regional strategies, such as the EU's new adaptation strategy, which has a big section on the international nature of climate risk, such as the African Union's new strategy, which also recognizes these sorts of risks. So very much at a policy level, but also at a practice level. And there are a number of initiatives, just to name one, which is the Spark project, and we have some representatives engaged in the Spark project here today, which aims to address gaps in agricultural and technological and social best practice to build the resilience of pastoralists, which of course face many of these risks. We see these sorts of programs emerging, but there is clearly still a long way that we have to go. So I'd like to open the floor now. We have about 10 minutes for our Q&A. I'm going to ask you in a moment to just raise your hand if you've got a question for our panel, to just state briefly your name and your role. Unfortunately, we're going to have to thank and say goodbye to Anne Hamill just because she has to be away at the Global Stocktake Technical Dialogues on Adaptation. But thank you so much for joining us, Anne. We'll give you a round of applause. But yes, this is a chance for your questions. While you're thinking of them, and thank you, I see you there. I'm just going to open the floor with a short question and comment from Volker Ratzmann, who is Executive Vice President for Corporate Public Policy and Regulation Management at DPDHL, because we haven't yet heard a private sector perspective. And we've heard that a lot of these risks cascade through trade and supply chains. So we'd love to hear what your reflections are on the need for public-private collaboration on these risks. And then I'll open the floor more widely.
Katie, thank you very much for having me, and thank you all very much for your insights in all these issues. I think what's clear and what's coming out very clear in this COP27 is that we have to enter from the era of ambition to the era of adoption. So we all have, and I think this is a challenge, especially for the private sector and for all the economies, to just adopt all these new technologies, to change processes, and even, to transform all these sectors into an area in a mode of decarbonization. And as a corporate and multinational company who runs a network, worldwide network in over 220 countries and region, and so being at least a backbone for global trade, I think we already took our responsibility to be a leader in transforming the transport sector by operating, and while we are operating these global networks and at least connecting people worldwide. So, and I'm a little bit wondering, how do you all envision us as corporations to support all your goals? What do you want from us to do to just adopt and to mitigate these risks and cascades? How can we cooperate a little bit more from the public sector and the private sector? I didn't hear reflections on this in what you have been pointing out. So how do you plan us to just accelerate the mitigation of all these risks coming out, and to accelerate the adoption of this new world, at least? Because to make it concrete, I think it's at least it's the economy and the people and the communities who must change the world.
Thank you so much, Volker. Just while you're thinking of your questions, perhaps I can turn to the panel to answer that question of what does the public sector need from the private sector to help manage these sorts of risks? And perhaps I'll turn to you, Peter, and yourself, Thomas, if you've considered what role the private sector might play in managing these risks, and what do you need from them as a government?
So as I said, when we're developing our new national adaptation plan, we're talking we're using our colleagues in our Department for International Trade. And I think what would be, I suppose, very beneficial is that kind of dialogue, specifically thinking around something like supply chains and talking about the vulnerability around food scarcity, and actually between us examining where the vulnerabilities really lie and looking at the long-term again, the scenario planning, if, as you said, more and more of these once-in-a-thousand-year events are happening at the same time, they are not anymore once in 1,000 years, they're significantly more frequent. And actually, how can we, as the public sector, incentivize, reduce barriers to enable you to create more resilient supply chains? I mean, as my colleague on the panel mentioned, as we've left the European Union, this has created trade challenges, and we just need to make sure that there are no barriers, as much as possible, with this been our gift, to make sure that we reduced any barriers that could potentially leave more vulnerable supply chains. I'm sure there's a myriad of other areas within the private sector, but again, for you to help us understand, where do you see, if there was a 2-degree shift, but there's also these opportunities. I'm sure there's many more that we'll be able to find with academic research, but things like trade routes through the Arctic. I mean, although personally I'm quite worried about the melting of the Arctic, but there are genuine, the opportunities to be able to move and use those supply chains. So I do think there's a way we can work together and explore these.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, just to chip in, I think my colleague has adequately addressed because of the building resilience of the supply chains, and also the private sector. When you talk of trade, actually at the core of the private sector involvement in the issues of trade, and how do you make sure that you come in to provide solutions and also to look at opportunities that come with it and address the challenges. And I know issues of reducing exposure, vulnerability. Actually, if you look even at climate finance, private sector plays a critical role. How do you help in reducing exposures and reducing vulnerabilities? At the same time, ensuring that you also we have a win-win solution for private sector and the public sector in all these. So basically, it's about ensuring that you have resilient supply chains in both internally and globally. And how do we link what's happening locally and at the global to make sure that we provide a win-win solutions by all. We have the tools that are not yet there. How can private sector also push research or support research into all this to come up with some of the solutions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Estherine, would you like to say a very quick word?
Yes, thank you. Just to add on the two, we have emphasized on the supply chains. I just also want to add the value chains, because particularly in the case of Africa, you do have a lot of private sector investment in the value chains, say, for instance, in the food system, agricultural value chains, to do all the things that have just been mentioned, research, building capacity of the off-takers that they work with, to be able to adapt to climate change. Yeah.
Thank you, Estherine. I think we have one more question here. And there's another one just there. I'll take them one after the other, and then we'll just do a quick last 2 minutes of remarks. You could say your name and where you're from. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. And first of all, I would like to thank all the presenters for the excellent presentations. And my name is Ngusu Dagesa. I come from Ethiopia, next door from Kenya, north of Kenya. And I represent the Ethiopian civil society organizations, where I am the president of the council there. And also I have my own organization called the Consortium of Christian Relief and Development Association, an umbrella organization for over 450 NGOs. My question now is for my brother from Kenya. Adaptation without border means cross-border collaboration for me. So that means, that's why I'm coming to my next door friend from Kenya. Ethiopia is also one of the countries suffering from vulnerable to climate change, as you know, suffering a lot in droughts and also floods sometimes. Also have our own dynamics inside, war, civil war, as you may know recently. But the good thing, there is one thing that I saw is the initiative that the Prime Minister of Ethiopia took over the past 3 years, probably you might have heard, of planting trees, starting with 4 billion 3 years. The following year were 5 billion, and last year was 6 billion. This is continuing. And now it's not only for Ethiopia, but he's feeling that, he also believes that the cross-border thing would affect not only the one in Kenya, the climate in Ethiopia, but also the cross-border. Now they started last year.
Can I ask you just to get to your question? I'm so sorry. It's only because we only have 2 minutes left.
Yes, I want to cut it down. Is there any initiative of that kind that is coming from the Kenyan side? If you have heard the news, please, to collaborate on this issue. Thank you.
I think we might have to leave it there on the questions. I'm so sorry, but we will come back to you at the end. And for all of those who are asking questions online, we will be doing a Q&A afterwards where we write up some of the answers to those questions on our website. So, Thomas, perhaps I can give you the final word before we wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, to be very brief, thank you for the question. And you said Ethiopia has really accelerated planting of trees. And also the new government has provided a new target of increasing our tree cover to 30% by 2022. And actually are targeting to plant 15 billion trees by 2032, which is quite ambitious. But we are determined that we're going to achieve that. And of course, all that will have benefit not only in Kenya, but the microclimate in the region will be improved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is up. I would like to really extend our sincere thanks and appreciation to all our speakers here today. Maybe we can give them a round of applause. And to all of you here in the room and also from joining us online. On behalf of everyone in Adaptation Without Borders, we'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all to reach out and to engage with us. We're really looking forward to working with you on these sorts of risks and on strengthening international cooperation on adaptation. We have a new briefing out at COP27 with our key messages and recommendations at a regional and global level, and a national level too. So we'll be handing some of those out, and you're welcome to a copy after the event. And you can look at the adaptationwithoutborders.org website for more information. Thank you so much. We're going to end with a 90-second video. But I'd just like to thank you all again for coming and to wish you a fantastic last 10 days at COP27. Thank you.
Our economies, societies, and ecosystems are deeply interconnected. When floods lead an international port to suspend operations, when heat waves and droughts damage crops, that people and countries across the world are waiting to eat, when glaciers melt high in the mountains and lead to catastrophes for people downstream, we see that the impacts of climate change cascade across national borders. Climate risk is a shared reality. Adaptation must become a shared responsibility. This means new understandings of adaptation as managing risk in an interconnected world, new initiatives on adaptation, moving beyond small-scale projects and domestic policies. New actors in adaptation, including finance, foreign affairs, and trade ministries. New scales of cooperation in adaptation between countries and regions. Only by working together can we build our collective resilience. COP27. It's time to shift the narrative on adaptation.